Omega, who was mocked for carrying empty offerings, until the Alpha King stepped in to reveal that the gift was far from empty. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to the main character. Ethan Cooper, the Omega, was no stranger to judgment. He had spent most of his life being underestimated and dismissed by those around him. Growing up in a world where the Alpha were revered and the Omega were often treated like second-class citizens, Ethan had learned to keep to himself. But one day, a seemingly small gesture would change everything. As part of a long-standing tradition, each year, the Omegas were required to present gifts to the Alpha King. It wasn't just a gesture of respect, it was a chance to prove their loyalty and worth. But when Ethan's turn came, he had nothing to offer but a simple, empty box. The murmurs began almost immediately. "What a fool," one whispered. "Doesn't he even know what's expected?" another scoffed. Ethan could hear them, but he tried not to let it affect him. He wasn't there for the approval of others. He was there to show that he could do this, even if he had nothing but the will to try. But no one saw it that way. Ethan's peers, the other Omegas, even some of the Alphas, laughed at his empty offering. Some didn't even bother to hide their contempt. "He's hopeless," someone muttered. "What does he think he's doing?" But despite the laughter, Ethan held his head high, even though his heart ached. He had no intention of giving up. His gift may have seemed empty, but in his mind, it was a symbol of his courage to show up at all. He had faced ridicule before, but this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't going to let their words break him. The Alpha King, Aiden Blackwood, watched from his throne. The powerful ruler had seen many gifts over the years, some extravagant, others simple. But when Ethan stepped forward, there was something in his eyes that intrigued Aiden. The others saw only the empty box, but Aiden saw something different, something that no one else seemed to notice. He rose from his throne and walked towards Ethan, his gaze steady and thoughtful. Without a word, he took the box from Ethan's hands and examined it closely. There was a silence in the room as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Ethan felt his pulse race, unsure of what Aiden might do next. Was he about to be ridiculed as well? Would he be punished for his audacity? But then, something unexpected happened. Aiden smiled, a small, knowing smile, and then he spoke. "This gift," he said, "is not empty at all." The room fell silent. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he couldn't understand why. Why would Aiden say such a thing? The Alpha King gently opened the box, revealing a small piece of parchment inside. It was a message, a symbol of Ethan's heart, of his quiet strength and resolve. It wasn't about the physical contents of the box, it was about what the box represented. Ethan had shown up when no one expected him to. He had stood tall when the world told him to bow. And that, Aiden knew, was worth more than any extravagant gift. "Ethan," Aiden continued, "sometimes the greatest gifts are not the ones that shine the brightest. They are the ones that are given with courage, with honesty, and with heart." Ethan's heart swelled with pride as the room erupted into applause. For the first time in his life, he felt seen, not for the empty box, but for the strength it took to carry it. Ivan had seen many things in his life, but none had quite shaken him like what had just occurred. Ethan, the Omega who had been ridiculed by so many, was now standing tall, his heart full, his gift no longer dismissed. As the room filled with applause, Ethan felt a rush of emotions he had never known before. He looked around at the faces of the people who had once looked down on him, only to find something unexpected: admiration. There was respect in their eyes now. They saw him. He wasn't just the Omega who had always been overlooked. He was someone who had earned his place. Ethan took a deep breath, his chest swelling with pride, but it was quickly followed by a sense of vulnerability. He hadn't expected this, didn't think anyone would truly understand his offering. But Alpha King Aiden Blackwood had, and that meant everything. Aiden's voice rang out once more, his words carrying the weight of his authority and the warmth of understanding. "This is what true strength looks like. Not in the flash of gold or the weight of riches, but in the quiet courage to stand by your truth." Those words echoed in Ethan's mind. his truth, his gift. Ethan had spent so much of his life trying to fit into a world that didn't seem to have a place for him. But now, in this moment, he understood that perhaps the world had been wrong all along. Perhaps he had always been enough. Aiden Blackwood turned to face the others in the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the crowd. The whispers had died down, the mocking tones replaced with respect. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Aiden continued, his voice firm yet filled with a quiet warmth. "Do not measure a person by what they can give you, but by who they are. The strength of a gift is not in its size, but in its meaning." Ethan could hardly believe his ears. It was as if the world had suddenly shifted. He had never imagined a moment like this. He thought he would always be the one in the shadows, the one dismissed before he even had the chance to show who he really was. But now, everything was different. The silence in the room was profound, as if everyone was absorbing Aiden's words. For a brief moment, Ethan caught a glimpse of the other Omegas in the room. Their expressions were no longer mocking or cruel. They were thoughtful. Some were even smiling, their gazes filled with something that might have been respect. But it wasn't just the Omegas who had been affected by Aiden's words. Ethan could see the Alphas too, their eyes now focused on him in a way they hadn't been before. Maybe they weren't entirely convinced yet, but something had changed. Something had shifted in the way they saw him. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't weak. He was a force to be reckoned with. Aiden approached Ethan once more, his tall frame, casting a shadow over him. But there was no intimidation in Aiden's presence, only a calm assurance. "Ethan," Aiden said quietly, his voice softer now, "you've proven something today, not to anyone else, but to yourself." Ethan looked up at the Alpha King, his heart beating faster. There was something in Aiden's eyes, something that said he understood. And for the first time in his life, Ethan felt seen. Not as an Omega, not as someone lesser, but as a person, as a human being, worthy of respect. He couldn't hold back the smile that spread across his face. It was small at first, a tentative thing. But as the applause continued around him, as Aiden stood beside him with that same quiet pride in his eyes, Ethan allowed himself to truly smile. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving, and he was going to make sure the world knew it. Ivan noticed the subtle shift in Ethan after that day. The Omega, who had once been the subject of ridicule, now moved through the halls with a quiet confidence. It wasn't arrogance, but something deeper, a sense of self-assurance that came from being seen, from being acknowledged in a way he had never experienced before. The way Aiden had looked at him, not with pity, but with understanding, had changed something inside of him. Ethan no longer felt invisible. He was beginning to realize that perhaps he had always been enough. The respect that he had longed for from others was starting to materialize, not in grand gestures or praise, but in the way people were now treating him differently. They didn't look at him as the Omega who was weak or lesser. They saw him as someone with strength, someone who had the courage to stand up when the odds were against him. And with every passing day, Ethan felt more and more like he belonged. He had always believed that the world saw him as something to be pitied or dismissed, but now, he was seeing it in a different light. The Alpha King's words had planted a seed in him, and now, he was watching it grow. The truth was, Ethan hadn't just gained the respect of the other Omegas. He had earned the respect of the Alphas too. As he walked through the corridors of the palace, he noticed the subtle change in the way the Alpha and Beta members of the court interacted with him. They no longer passed him by without so much as a glance. There was recognition in their eyes now, a quiet acknowledgement of who he was. The halls, once cold and distant, had begun to feel like a place where he belonged. Ethan knew that the road ahead would not be easy. He wasn't naive enough to believe that everything would suddenly be perfect. The world he lived in was still full of expectations, and the divide between Alphas and Omegas wasn't something that could be erased overnight. But for the first time, Ethan believed that maybe, just maybe, things could change. He could change. As days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself walking the palace grounds more often. He had always avoided the bustling courtyards, staying in the quieter, less crowded parts of the palace. But now, he found himself walking with purpose, his head held high. The sun had begun to feel warmer on his skin, the air smelled fresher, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was breathing freely. It was during one of these walks that he saw Aiden again. The Alpha King had been keeping to his duties, but their paths had crossed more frequently lately. Each time, Aiden would offer a brief nod, a silent recognition of Ethan's growth. There was no need for words. The connection between them had shifted, and it was undeniable. It wasn't just a matter of authority anymore. It was something more: respect, mutual understanding, and something that Ethan wasn't quite ready to name yet. But there was a feeling deep inside him, one that grew stronger every time Aiden looked at him. One day, while walking through the garden, Aiden approached Ethan. His tall figure stood out against the greenery, his eyes sharp and focused. Ethan turned to face him, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. "You've come a long way, Ethan," Aiden said, his voice as steady as ever, but with something softer behind it. "I've been watching you." Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. He wasn't sure what to say at first, so he simply nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "For what you said that day, it changed everything for me." Aiden's gaze softened. "It wasn't just my words, Ethan," he said. "You had it in you all along. You just needed to see it." Ethan felt a warmth spread through him. The Alpha King's words weren't just words. They were a truth that had unlocked something inside him, something that had been dormant for far too long. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being real, about standing firm in who he was, even when the world tried to tell him otherwise. And for the first time, Ethan believed it. He wasn't just an Omega anymore. He was Ethan Cooper, someone who had earned his place, someone who was worthy of being seen. Ethan had started to realize that the world around him was beginning to change. No longer was he the invisible Omega who slinked around the edges of the palace. His presence was acknowledged now, noticed, respected even. But as he walked through the gardens, his thoughts were still lingering on Aiden's words. They had shaken him in ways he hadn't expected, and for the first time in his life, Ethan found himself truly questioning what it meant to be seen, what it meant to be valued. Could he really believe that he was enough? Could he step into the future, not as the person he thought the world expected, but as the person he was truly meant to be? The next day, Ethan found himself facing another challenge. He had always kept to the shadows, but now, as his confidence grew, so did the expectations placed on him. People began to look at him differently, as if he were no longer just the quiet, unremarkable Omega, but someone who had proven his worth. And with that recognition came pressure. It wasn't as if anyone was outright unkind to him, but the looks, the subtle glances, were enough to make him feel like he was still walking a tightrope. He could sense that the other Omegas were starting to see him as a leader, and though he didn't feel quite ready to assume that role, there was a part of him that recognized the weight of the responsibility. He was no longer just one of the many. He was someone people were starting to watch. Ethan took a deep breath, reminding himself of what Aiden had said. The strength of a gift is not in its size, but in its meaning. Maybe it wasn't about being perfect or meeting other people's expectations. Maybe it was about staying true to himself, even when everything felt new and uncertain. That afternoon, as he walked through the corridors of the palace, he passed the same courtiers who had once dismissed him, and for the first time, they didn't sneer or turn away. Instead, they acknowledged him, some with a nod, others with a quiet smile. Ethan's heart swelled with pride, but it was tempered with something else. He felt the weight of it all. The recognition was both a blessing and a burden. Just as he was starting to think about how he might navigate this new chapter, he saw Aiden again. The Alpha King was standing by the fountain, his silhouette sharp against the setting sun. Aiden looked up as Ethan approached, offering him a small but sincere smile. There was something in the way Aiden looked at him now, something different from before. It was as if the Alpha King had come to see Ethan not just as an Omega, but as someone worthy of respect. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then walked up to him. "Your words, they've helped me more than you know," Ethan said, his voice quieter than he had intended. Aiden nodded, his gaze never leaving Ethan's. "You've done the hard part, Ethan. You've shown up. That's more than most people can say." Ethan felt a knot form in his throat. The Alpha King's words were simple, but they carried so much weight. "I never thought I could be someone who made a difference," Ethan confessed, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I always thought I'd just be the quiet one in the background." Aiden stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "You are making a difference, Ethan. By being yourself. By showing the world that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to not have all the answers. That's where real strength lies." Ethan met Aiden's eyes again, and for the first time, he didn't see the Alpha King as a figure of power who towered over him. Instead, he saw a man who understood him, a man who saw his potential. Ethan could feel the change deep within him, a quiet revolution of self-acceptance. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to fit into anyone else's mold. He was enough, just as he was. And that was more than enough to start making a difference. As they stood there together, surrounded by the beauty of the garden and the warm glow of the fading sun, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle within him. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, he was no longer afraid of it. Ethan had started to feel like a different person. The journey he had been on since that fateful day in the palace was changing him in ways he could not have predicted. He no longer saw himself as someone to be pitied or overlooked. Instead, he saw the quiet strength he had always carried within him. The respect from the other Omegas, the acknowledgement from the Alphas, and the unwavering support from Aiden had helped him realize something profound. He was worth something. The feeling of walking through the halls, knowing that people were now seeing him, truly seeing him, filled him with a sense of pride he hadn't known before. But as he moved forward, Ethan found that the journey of self-acceptance was far from easy. The expectations placed on him were heavier than ever. The court had begun to look to him for guidance, and with it came a pressure that weighed on his shoulders. He had never been one for attention, and now it felt like every move he made was being scrutinized. The whispers that followed him were different now, not mocking, but curious, respectful even. But that didn't stop the nervous tension that gnawed at him. Ethan had always been someone who preferred to stay in the background. The thought of stepping into a leadership role was daunting. Could he really be the one to show others the way? Would he be able to live up to the expectations that were now placed on him? As the days passed, Ethan's internal struggle deepened. He found himself torn between the person he had always been and the person everyone was expecting him to become. He didn't want to disappoint anyone, especially not Aiden. The Alpha King had given him so much faith, so much hope. Ethan knew he couldn't let Aiden down. But how could he live up to something that felt so far beyond him? One evening, after another long day of court duties, Ethan retreated to the garden, the one place where he felt he could truly be himself. He had always loved the peace of the garden, the way the flowers seemed to speak to him in their silence. The soft rustle of the leaves, the scent of the roses, it was all so calming. Ethan walked slowly, lost in thought, trying to sort through his emotions. It was then that he saw Aiden again. The Alpha King was standing near the fountain, looking out over the water. His tall frame was silhouetted by the fading light of the setting sun. Aiden turned as he heard Ethan approach, his expression softening as he saw the Omega walking toward him. Ethan stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say. Aiden looked at him with those deep, knowing eyes, and for a moment, it felt like the world around them had stopped. "Ethan," Aiden said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that reached deep into Ethan's chest. "You don't have to carry all of this alone." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had been trying so hard to figure everything out on his own, but here was Aiden, offering him exactly what he needed: comfort, support, and a reminder that he wasn't in this battle by himself. "I don't know if I can do this," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's so much expected of me now. I don't know if I'm ready." Aiden stepped closer, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder, grounding him in the moment. "You don't have to be ready," Aiden said. "You just have to be yourself. That's all anyone can ask of you." Ethan looked up at the Alpha King, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. In Aiden's presence, he felt seen and accepted, exactly as he was. For the first time, Ethan realized that he didn't have to have everything figured out. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Aiden gave him a reassuring smile before walking away, leaving Ethan standing in the garden. But this time, he didn't feel so alone. The weight of the world didn't seem as heavy, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he could breathe. The path ahead was still uncertain, but he no longer feared it. With Aiden's support, and the strength he had found within himself, Ethan knew that he was ready to face whatever came next. Ethan had been walking through the halls of the palace for what felt like hours, trying to clear his mind. The pressure of the new expectations was starting to weigh on him again. Despite Aiden's reassurance, the doubt that lingered in the back of his mind refused to go away. What if he wasn't ready? What if he didn't measure up to the image people had of him now? As the days went by, the reality of his new role became clearer, and it wasn't as easy as he had hoped. The Omegas were looking up to him, but the weight of that responsibility felt like it might crush him at any moment. The Alphas had started to pay more attention to him too, not just out of respect, but because they saw something in him that they hadn't seen before. Ethan had begun attending meetings that were once far beyond his reach. He was asked for his opinions, his thoughts, and each time, he tried to speak with confidence, but inside, he was unsure. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and now, it felt like the world was watching his every move. That afternoon, as he sat quietly by the window in his chambers, Ethan couldn't help but think back to everything that had happened. He thought about the moment when Aiden had stood beside him, offering words of encouragement. That moment had been a turning point for him, but now, the uncertainty was creeping back in. Maybe I'm not cut out for this, he whispered to himself. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he heard a knock at the door. He quickly wiped away the doubt, hoping it hadn't shown on his face. "Come in," he called, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The door opened, and to Ethan's surprise, Aiden stepped inside. "I thought I'd find you here," Aiden said with a small smile. "The garden has always been your retreat, hasn't it?" Ethan didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected Aiden to come looking for him. "I didn't mean to make you worry," he said, avoiding Aiden's gaze. Aiden took a few steps forward and then stopped, giving Ethan the space he needed. "You don't need to apologize," Aiden replied, his voice calm and reassuring. "But you do need to understand that you're not alone in this. You've come so far, Ethan, and it's okay to feel unsure sometimes. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." Ethan turned to look at Aiden, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "But what if I fail?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I can't live up to the expectations people have for me?" Aiden shook his head, his expression serious yet warm. "You won't fail, Ethan, because you're not trying to be someone you're not. You're just being yourself, and that's enough." The weight of Aiden's words settled over him, easing the tightness in his chest. For the first time in days, Ethan felt a sense of relief. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about meeting every expectation. It was about being true to himself. "You've already made a difference," Aiden continued, his voice steady. "And you'll keep making a difference, no matter what." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Aiden's belief in him had always been a steady anchor, and now, more than ever, Ethan could feel the strength in those words. He wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, he was ready after all. With a newfound sense of determination, Ethan stood up, facing Aiden with a quiet confidence he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you," he said, his voice strong. "I needed to hear that." Aiden smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "You're welcome. But remember, Ethan, you don't need anyone's permission to be who you are. You've already proven that." Ethan smiled back, a real smile this time, one that came from deep within. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. With Aiden by his side and the strength he had found within himself, Ethan knew he was ready to face whatever came next. Ethan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his jacket, his hands trembling slightly. It wasn't the fabric of the garment that made him uneasy, nor the formality of the event that awaited him. It was the gathering of the court, the weight of the expectations, and the reality of what he had become, a leader, of sorts, though he still wasn't entirely sure he deserved the title. But he had come a long way since that first moment in the palace, and the thought of turning back now was impossible. He had been given a chance to prove himself, not just to others, but to himself. The doors to the grand hall loomed ahead, and for the first time, Ethan didn't feel that wave of nervousness that had always been his constant companion. He had learned to carry himself with dignity, with purpose. The world might still see him as an Omega, but he knew better now. He was not just an Omega. He was Ethan Cooper, someone who had earned his place. As he stepped into the hall, the murmur of conversation faded, and all eyes turned toward him. The room was filled with alphas, betas, and omegas, each one holding their breath as they waited for him to make his move. Ethan walked forward, his gaze steady, his heart pounding in his chest, but this time, it wasn't fear that caused the rapid beats. It was anticipation. As he passed through the crowd, He could feel the weight of their stares. Some were curious, some respectful, and others, well, he knew there were still those who doubted him. But that didn't matter anymore. He wasn't here to win anyone over. He was here because he had something to say, something he needed to express. When he reached the front of the room, where Aiden was standing, his gaze met the Alpha King's, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. There was no judgment in Aiden's eyes, no doubt. Only encouragement. Only belief. Ethan took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice clear, steady, and stronger than he had ever imagined it could be. My fellow Omegas, Betas, and Alphas, he started, his eyes scanning the room. I stand before you today not as someone who was born to be lesser, but as someone who has worked hard to earn every bit of respect I've been given. The room was quiet, hanging on every word. For so long, I believed that I didn't matter, that I would always be overlooked. But through my journey, I've learned that it's not about the title we're given or the expectations placed on us. It's about the strength we find within ourselves, the courage to stand up when no one expects us to. He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. And I am here today because I chose to stand up, not for anyone else's approval, but for my own. I am here because I finally understand that I have a place in this world, and it's not determined by what anyone else thinks of me. There was a hushed silence in the room, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt a tremor of doubt. Was he saying the right thing? But then, he saw it. The subtle nods, the understanding in the eyes of those around him. The room wasn't just listening, they were hearing him. He wasn't speaking to them as an Omega or a figure of pity. He was speaking as Ethan, a person, with a story to tell. I have been given a gift, he continued. The chance to lead, to show what we, as Omegas, are capable of. But more than that, I've been given the chance to prove to myself that I am worthy. Worthy of standing here, worthy of being seen, and worthy of being a part of something greater than myself. The room seemed to hold its breath as Ethan's words settled in. And then, as if on cue, Aiden stepped forward, his presence commanding but gentle. He gave Ethan a look that spoke volumes, pride, admiration, and a silent promise that this was only the beginning. Ethan didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, surrounded by those who had once doubted him, he knew he was ready to face it. The journey had just begun, and he would walk it with his head held high, not because he was perfect, but because he knew now that he was enough. Ethan stood in the courtyard, the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the palace filling the air. The weight of his words still lingered in his mind. He had never imagined speaking in front of such a large crowd, let alone speaking with the confidence that had surged through him. As he gazed up at the sky, a sense of peace settled over him, but it was mixed with a realization. This was just the beginning. There was still much to prove, but for the first time, he was ready for it. As the days went by, Ethan began to take on more responsibilities. The palace that had once felt like a place of isolation now seemed like home. He spent his days meeting with the other Omegas, discussing their needs, their hopes, and their struggles. They no longer saw him as someone to pity. They looked to him for guidance, and Ethan gave it, not with arrogance, but with the understanding that came from his own journey. He was becoming the leader they had always needed. The court had also begun to change. No longer were the Omegas seen as weak or lesser. They were respected, their opinions valued. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. And Ethan knew he was part of that change. As the weeks passed, his bond with Aiden grew stronger. The Alpha King had never once treated him as inferior, but now, there was something more between them. It wasn't just the mutual respect of two people with a shared goal. There was a deeper connection, one forged through understanding and trust. One evening, as the sun began to set, Aiden approached Ethan in the garden, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the fading light. You've done well, Ethan, Aiden said, his voice steady, yet warm. I can see how much you've grown, and the people can see it too. Ethan turned to face him, a soft smile crossing his lips. I couldn't have done it without you, he said quietly. Your belief in me has made all the difference. Aiden nodded, his expression sincere. You had the potential all along. You just needed to believe in yourself. The words echoed in Ethan's mind. He had come so far, and yet, it was only the beginning. He had once thought that his value was determined by how others saw him. But now, he understood that his worth came from within. It wasn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It was about embracing who he was and standing tall in the face of whatever challenges came his way. As he stood there, in the garden with Aiden, Ethan realized that he was no longer the uncertain Omega who had stumbled into the palace all those months ago. He was someone different, stronger, more confident, and ready to face whatever the future held. "I'm ready," Ethan said, his voice firm, as though he were speaking to himself as much as to Aiden. "I'm ready to lead." Aiden's smile widened, pride in his eyes. "I never doubted it." And as the two of them stood there, the sky darkening above them, Ethan knew that he was no longer alone. He had found his place, not just in the palace, but in the world. He had earned the right to stand alongside those who had once looked down on him. The journey had been long, but it had shaped him into someone new. Someone who was no longer afraid to be himself. And with that, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle deep within him, knowing that the future was his to shape. Ethan stood on the balcony of the palace, looking out over the sprawling landscape below. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the fields, and the breeze carried the faint scent of the flowers from the garden. It had been months since that pivotal day when everything had changed, and Ethan could hardly believe how far he had come. The once timid Omega who had been ridiculed for carrying empty offerings was now a respected leader, someone who had earned the trust of those around him. The court, once cold and indifferent, now regarded him with a sense of respect. It was a subtle shift, but it was real. The other Omegas looked up to him, not with pity or scorn, but with admiration. They saw in him what he had always hoped to see in himself: strength, courage, and the ability to lead. Ethan had found his place. As he stood there, reflecting on how far he had come, he was interrupted by a soft voice. "I thought I'd find you here." Ethan turned to see Aiden approaching, his tall frame cutting through the fading light. The Alpha King looked at him with a quiet smile, his gaze full of pride. "You've done well, Ethan," Aiden said, stepping up beside him. "The court is different now. You've changed things for the better." Ethan smiled, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "I never thought I could make this kind of difference," he said quietly. "It feels surreal." Aiden nodded, understanding. "It's not always easy to see the impact we have on the world around us. But you've made your mark. The people respect you now, not because of who you are, but because of what you've become. You've proven to them that you're not just an Omega. You're a leader." Ethan felt a sense of warmth spread through him. Aiden's words were like a balm to his soul. He had never sought to be a leader. He had simply wanted to find a place where he could be valued. But now, with the support of the court and Aiden by his side, he realized that he had become something he hadn't imagined, a symbol of hope for those who had once been overlooked. "I couldn't have done it without you," Ethan said, turning to face Aiden. "Your belief in me gave me the strength to believe in myself." Aiden smiled, his eyes softening. "You had the strength all along, Ethan. I just gave you the nudge you needed to see it." There was a pause, and then Ethan spoke again, his voice more confident this time. "I'm ready," he said, his eyes meeting Aiden's with newfound determination. "I'm ready to lead. Not just for the Omegas, but for everyone." Aiden's smile grew wider, and he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I knew you were ready from the moment I saw you stand up for yourself. You don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, Ethan. You've already shown who you are." Ethan looked out at the horizon, his heart full. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't defined by his past, by the labels others had placed on him. He was Ethan Cooper, a man who had fought for his place in the world and had earned it. The future, though uncertain, no longer seemed so daunting. With Aiden by his side and the respect of those around him, Ethan knew he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey was far from over, but he no longer feared it. He had become the person he was always meant to be, and he was ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold.